A former troublemaker seeks redemption by rebuilding his community, but when a dangerous past resurfaces, he faces a choice that could cost him everything. Will he find peace or lose himself once more? Ramon pulled his worn jacket tighter against the chill of the night air. The streets were deserted, a stillness settling over the neighborhood that felt both eerie and familiar. After 16 hours at the warehouse, his body ached with exhaustion, but there was comfort in the quiet walk home. The rhythmic sound of his boots echoed off the graffiti-streaked walls of the narrow alley, each step a ritual marking the end of another long day. The faint hum of distant music drifted through broken windows, interrupted by a sudden noise, quick footsteps just beyond the corner. Ramon's shoulders tensed, his pace instinctively slowing. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the brick walls as he turned into the alley, and there they were, 3 figures waiting for him. Diego stood at the center, his confidence radiating in the way he carried himself, chin high and hands shoved into his pockets. Behind him, 2 others flanked his position, nervous and twitchy, their bravado cracking beneath thin facades of arrogance. Ramon knew the look well. It was the kind of arrogance born of inexperience, boys playing men's games. "Hey, old man," Diego called, his voice smug. "Late night for you, huh?" Ramon said nothing, his eyes scanning the scene. The alley was narrow, littered with abandoned crates and garbage bins. No easy way out. The boys hadn't just stumbled into him, they'd been waiting. "Don't ignore us," Diego pressed, stepping forward. The dim light caught the flash of a blade in his hand, its edge glinting with casual menace. "You've got something we want." "I don't carry money," Ramon replied flatly. His voice, though quiet, carried an undertone that wiped the smirks off the other boys' faces. Diego, however, only laughed. "Who said anything about money? Maybe you've got other valuables." His friends shifted nervously at the vague threat, but Diego didn't waver. He relished the tension, mistaking Ramon's calm as weakness. Ramon exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Walk away," he said simply. Diego tilted his head, incredulous. "What was that?" "I said walk away. Go home." The words hung in the alley like a warning bell before a storm, but Diego sneered, his pride pricked. "You've got a big mouth for a tired old man." With a jerk of his hand, Diego lunged, the knife aimed high. Ramon reacted without thought. Years of training, buried under layers of a mundane life, surfaced like a wave crashing through him. His hand shot up, intercepting Diego's wrist mid-air. The force of Ramon's grip wrenched the blade free, sending it clattering to the ground. In the same motion, he twisted Diego's arm sharply, and the boy cried out, stumbling to his knees. The other 2 froze, shock painting their faces pale. "Get him!" one of them yelled, hesitation lacing his voice. They rushed Ramon together, but it was over before it started. Ramon sidestepped the first boy, driving his elbow into his ribs with pinpoint precision. The boy wheezed and crumpled to the ground. The second attacker swung wildly with a broken bottle. Ramon ducked under the arc, sweeping his leg behind the boy's knees and sending him crashing into a pile of crates. The alley was silent again, save for the groans of Diego and his friends sprawled on the cold pavement. Ramon stood still, his breathing steady, his eyes sharp. The shadows seemed deeper now, as though they'd swallowed whatever remained of Diego's bravado. Diego looked up at Ramon with wide eyes, clutching his arm. "What are you—" "Go home," Ramon said softly, though the weight of his voice hit harder than any blow. He turned his back on them, pausing only to kick Diego's knife into the nearest storm drain. The sound of it clattering down echoed like a distant warning. For a moment, none of them moved. Ramon walked to the alley's end, his steps measured and unhurried. He didn't look back, though he felt their stares drilling into his back. Disbelief, fear, and perhaps something else. Ramon wasn't proud of what he'd done, but as the alley emptied behind him, he knew he hadn't had a choice. When he reached the street, the cold air stung his cheeks. He pulled his jacket close again and resumed his walk, the distant sounds of the neighborhood returning, as though nothing had happened. But Ramon knew better. Something had shifted tonight, and even the silence felt heavier now. Ramon sat in the dim glow of his small living room, the ticking of an old clock filling the silence like a ghostly heartbeat. The modest house, a far cry from his younger days, seemed to shrink around him. Shadows from the single lamp spilled over the faded wallpaper, casting shapes that moved when Ramon wasn't looking. His eyes lingered on a wooden box atop the shelf, a box that should have stayed forgotten. Slowly, he rose, the creak of his chair splitting the stillness, and his steps carried a weight his body no longer deserved. With calloused fingers, he opened the box. Dust lifted into the air as though the past itself had been waiting to escape. Inside lay remnants of a life buried long ago. A tarnished switchblade with initials carved on the handle, faded photographs curling at the edges, and a single silver ring, its surface worn by years of use. Ramon lifted the blade, its steel cold against his skin, and in that instant, his mind opened like a wound. El Lobo. The name echoed in his head, whispered like a curse. Ramon could hear the echoes of old streets, the muffled shouts of men, and the sharp ring of metal meeting bone. He had been feared once, a shadow prowling through the chaos, leaving only silence behind. He remembered the weight of his fist, the bite of bloodied knuckles, reminders of violence that never truly washed away. His gaze fell to the scars on his hands, pale streaks crisscrossing his skin. Each one earned, he thought bitterly. Ramon clenched his fists and returned the switchblade to the box, shutting it with a hollow thud. The past had no place here. At least that was the lie he kept telling himself. A soft knock broke his trance. Ramon, Clara's voice carried through the thin door, hesitant but steady. Ramon sighed, his heavy shoulders rising and falling as he pushed the box back onto the shelf. He crossed the room and opened the door just enough to meet her eyes. Clara, with her untamed curls and deep brown eyes, stood holding a small tray of food. The faint aroma of tamales reached him, but he barely noticed. "I didn't see you at the market today," she said gently. "You didn't eat, did you?" "I'm fine," Ramon muttered, his voice low and gravelly. He started to close the door, but Clara's hand stopped him. "You don't look fine." Her gaze lingered on his face, studying him in a way that made Ramon feel exposed. "You've been distant since what happened yesterday. Everyone's talking about it." I said I'm fine. His tone sharpened, and Clara flinched just slightly before regaining her composure. "Fine," she echoed, her voice soft but edged with frustration. I know what it's like to keep things bottled up. You don't have to be alone, Ramon." Her words hung in the air, and for a fleeting moment, Ramon felt something loosen inside him. But the past wasn't something to be shared. It was a weight only he could carry. "Good night, Clara," he said firmly, closing the door. Ramon leaned his back against it, listening as Clara's footsteps faded down the hallway. The silence returned, thicker now, pressing in from all sides. He glanced at the shelf where the box lay hidden once more. The whispers of El Lobo crept back into his mind, uninvited but unrelenting. With a groan, Ramon turned off the light and collapsed into the chair again. The darkness felt familiar, almost comforting. Yet his mind offered no reprieve. Scars, voices, and forgotten faces clawed at him from the shadows. Outside, the night was quiet, but inside Ramon's head, a storm raged. And though he longed for peace, Ramon knew better than anyone that some past could never stay buried. Diego sat at the corner table of the dimly lit cafe, his hands clenched into fists as he replayed the scene in his mind. The laughter, sharp, stinging, still echoed in his ears. The image of that old man, Ramon, standing victorious over him, felt like a brand on his pride. He had been humiliated, his strength dismissed as if it were nothing, and now he could barely meet the eyes of the friends sitting around him. Luis leaned forward, his voice low but insistent. "You let that old man beat you? Just like that?" Diego's face flushed. "I didn't let him do anything." His jaw tightened and he punched the wooden table, startling everyone. "He caught me off guard, that's it. Next time, I'll make sure he knows who he's dealing with." The others exchanged uneasy glances. Javier, who was always the first to doubt, chuckled dryly. "You talk big, Diego, but everyone in the neighborhood's already heard. You're the guy who got put down by a man older than our grandfathers." The words hit harder than any punch Diego had ever taken. He shot to his feet, towering over the table. "You think this is funny?" His voice carried through the cafe, and conversations quieted momentarily as a few heads turned their way. Diego sat back down, glaring at Javier. "You'll see. I'm going to fix this." "Fix what?" Javier smirked. "Your pride?" "Yes." Diego's voice was cold now, measured. "And I'll start by figuring out who Ramon really is." Diego spent the next day lurking through the narrow streets and hidden alleys of the neighborhood, asking subtle questions about the old man. Most people shrugged him off, unwilling to share anything, while others warned him with furtive glances. But it was during a cigarette break behind Don Emilio's shop that he finally heard something interesting. Two older men sat on overturned crates, their voices a low murmur carried by the wind. Diego leaned against the wall, close enough to listen but far enough to avoid suspicion. "I swear," one of them muttered. "Ramon's got the look of a man who's seen things. You remember the old stories? About El Lobo?" "El Lobo?" The other scoffed. "That's a legend. A ghost parents used to scare kids into behaving." The first man shook his head. No. I'm telling you, some of those rumors about El Lobo were real. A soldier? Maybe a killer? No one knows, but they say he disappeared years ago. I'm just saying that old man Ramon gives me the same feeling, like he's been through war. You don't mess with a man like that." Diego's pulse quickened. El Lobo, a name that hung in the air like smoke. It sounded dangerous, mysterious, exactly what he needed to justify his defeat. If Ramon really was connected to the legend, then maybe his loss wasn't as shameful as it seemed. But the thought only fueled his resolve. If this Lobo is real, I'll prove I'm stronger. That night, Diego sat alone in his room, his phone light illuminating a scrap of paper. He scribbled down everything he'd heard. His mind buzzed with possibilities, but underneath it all was a single gnawing thought: I can't let this stand. In the silence, he whispered to himself, "No one humiliates me and gets away with it." Outside, the distant hum of the city seemed to respond, a predator lurking in the dark. Ramon knew trouble was brewing. The alley incident had unsettled the delicate tension of the neighborhood, and silence carried an edge sharper than broken glass. Gabriel had struck back with unexpected ferocity, and Ramon had no doubt that Diego and his friends, hot-headed, prideful boys, wouldn't let it rest. He moved with purpose, leaning on his cane as he navigated through the narrow streets. Sunlight stretched thin between crumbling buildings, casting jagged shadows on the walls. The air smelled of dust and fried food, and distant music mixed with the noise of daily life. Despite the normality around him, Ramon's instincts screamed of a storm coming. He spotted them in the usual spot, a corner near an abandoned shop where paint flaked like peeling skin. Diego leaned against the wall, cigarette dangling from his lips, flanked by two of his friends, Marco and Joaquim. Their laughter stopped when they noticed Ramon approaching. The old man's gaze cut through the space like a blade. Ramon was no stranger to dealing with boys like these, reckless, angry, searching for something to prove. "Diego," Ramon's voice was gravelly, weathered with years of warnings and unheeded advice. "A word." Diego raised an eyebrow but didn't move. "Why don't you keep walking, Valio? We're busy." Ramon ignored the jab and stepped closer. "I'm here to save you from your own stupidity, boy. What happened in that alley? Let it go." Marco scoffed, puffing out his chest. "He's the one who started it. You saw what he did to us?" Ramon's glare fell on him, and the boy faltered. "I saw you biting off more than you could chew. That man isn't someone you want to provoke." Diego's face twisted, the faint bruise near his jaw dark against his skin. "He's an old man, Ramon, alone, weak." Ramon took a step forward, his voice lowering to a tone that carried weight. "Weak? If you really believe that, you're bigger fools than I thought. I'm telling you to leave him be. Walk away before you get hurt. Again." The warning hung in the air, heavy as lead. For a brief moment, Ramon thought he saw hesitation flicker in Diego's eyes, the ghost of common sense clawing at him. But then Marco spoke up, loud and biting. "We're not scared of him, and we're not scared of you either." Diego's posture hardened. He straightened, throwing Ramon a look of simmering defiance. "Old man, you don't get to tell us what to do. That guy embarrassed us. That doesn't go unanswered." Ramon shook his head slowly, disappointment weighing on his shoulders. "You're fools, all of you. I tried to warn you. If you go after him again, you'll regret it. That man, he's something you don't understand." "Go home, Ramon," Diego snapped, voice cold. For a moment, Ramon stared at them, boys playing at being men, too blind to see the edge of the cliff they were standing on. Finally, he turned. "Have it your way," he muttered, his cane tapping against the pavement as he walked away. "But don't say no one warned you." Behind him, laughter bubbled up, sharp and mocking, but it couldn't drown out Ramon's sinking feeling. The streets felt heavier now, as though the very air braced itself for what was coming. Ramon glanced back once, the corner already swallowed by shadows. "They'll learn," he thought grimly, "but it won't be the lesson they wanted." The streets carried him home, but his thoughts remained unsettled. Trouble was not just coming. It was already here. lurking just beneath the surface, ready to devour anyone foolish enough to ignore its warning signs. Ramon could only hope he wouldn't have to say, "I told you so." The morning sun cut through Diego's window in thin, golden lines, failing to warm the icy weight that had settled in his chest. Ramon's words from the night before echoed in his mind like a cruel refrain. He was there, that night. Diego had dug into the past countless times, turning over rumors, half-truths, and cryptic memories of his father's death. Yet nothing prepared him for the gut-wrenching clarity that came with Ramon's name attached to it. A name he trusted, no, respected, was now tainted. His boots struck the ground hard as he walked through the dusty courtyard of the ranch. Birds flapped away from the trees as if sensing his turbulent energy. Diego found himself at the old barn, where everything seemed a little quieter, an illusion of calm that only magnified the storm within. "This can't be true," he muttered, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of a rusted pitchfork. But the pieces fit too perfectly. Ramon had been near his father that fateful day, a time Diego had been too young to fully comprehend. Whispers of betrayal, an accident, or worse, seeped back into his mind like poison. The man who'd given him advice, who'd stood like a shadowed mentor, had also been there. The barn door creaked open behind him. Diego didn't need to turn to know it was Ramon. "Mornin'," Ramon greeted, his voice weathered like dry wood, though he clearly sensed something was amiss. Diego spun on his heel, his eyes colder than Ramon had ever seen. "You lied to me." Ramon stopped mid-step, his brow furrowing beneath his dusty hat. "What are you talking about? You were there, weren't you?" Diego's voice was raw. "The night my father died, you were there." Ramon stiffened. For a moment, the old man seemed smaller, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "Where'd you hear that?" "It doesn't matter," Diego roared, the pitchfork crashing to the ground as he stepped forward. "Tell me it isn't true." Ramon didn't answer. Instead, he let the silence between them grow heavy, pressing down like a stone on Diego's chest. The truth was written on his face, etched into every line, every weary crease. "It was an accident," Ramon finally said, his voice hoarse, eyes locked on the barn floor. "I never wanted him dead. I tried to stop it, but things got out of hand." Diego felt as though the ground had fallen from beneath his feet. His breath came in shallow bursts, fists trembling at his sides. This man, someone he'd come to rely on, was part of the very tragedy that had shaped his life. "You should have told me," Diego spat, barely able to look at Ramon. "You owed me that much." Ramon raised his gaze, and for the first time Diego saw regret, not just in his eyes but in the way he carried himself, as though every step was penance for a past he could never rewrite. I thought if I stayed close I could make it right." Ramon's voice cracked, betraying the years of guilt that had festered within him. "But some ghosts don't stay buried, boy. Not forever." Diego said nothing. His heart was a battlefield, torn between fury and the hollow ache of betrayal. He turned on his heel, leaving Ramon alone in the barn's cold, heavy silence. As Diego stormed back across the ranch, Ramon sank onto a bale of hay, burying his face in his hands. Outside, the sun blazed mercilessly, but Ramon felt nothing but shadows pressing in, old ghosts clawing their way back to haunt him. For both men, the past had come alive again, and there would be no peace until it was put to rest. The air inside the abandoned warehouse was stifling, thick with the scent of rust and stale water. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting jagged beams onto dusty concrete. Shadows of forgotten machinery loomed like specters against the walls. Ramon stood near the center, his posture deceptively relaxed, one hand tucked into his worn jacket. His ears caught the faint crunch of footsteps outside. They were coming. Diego was the first to enter, his silhouette sharp and imposing. A smirk curled across his lips as he stepped into the faint light, followed by 4 others who fanned out like vultures preparing to feast. Each carried improvised weapons, pipes, chains, a knife glinting under the moon's feeble glow. "So this is where you've been hiding, old man," Diego called, his voice bouncing off the hollow walls. His words dripped with mockery, but his eyes held a gleam of menace. Ramon didn't respond. His eyes moved carefully, calculating the space and positioning of each young man. He noticed their eagerness, their restlessness, the impulsiveness of boys who thought strength came in numbers. Ramon exhaled slowly. This wasn't his first ambush. You should have kept your head down, Diego continued, taking slow, deliberate steps forward. But you couldn't, could you? Someone like you don't get to walk away. The words sliced through Ramon, though his face remained stone. He stayed silent, his fingers curling tighter in his pocket. Spread out, Diego ordered, waving the others forward. Let's teach him a lesson. The group advanced, their confidence growing with every step. Ramon moved with calculated calm, letting them think they had the advantage. He waited until one of the boys, a lanky figure gripping a metal pipe, lunged at him from the side. Ramon pivoted. With one fluid motion, he caught the boy's wrist and twisted sharply, forcing him to drop the pipe with a metallic clang. Ramon shoved him backward into a stack of crates. Another charged from behind, swinging a chain. Ramon ducked just in time, his movements efficient, like an old soldier following instinct rather than thought. The fight erupted in chaotic bursts of sound, grunts of effort, clattering metal, and the shuffling of feet. Ramon danced between them, staying just ahead of their blows. He didn't strike to injure. He aimed to disarm, to disable without causing more harm than necessary. One by one, they faltered. Diego, however, stayed back, observing. His eyes narrowed as his friends struggled and fell. Frustration darkened his face, and his voice cut through the noise. Enough! Ramon froze mid-step, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The others staggered back, panting and humiliated. Diego stepped forward, his smirk replaced by something colder. You fight like you've done this before, he said quietly. Like you've been someone before. Ramon's jaw tightened. You don't know me. Oh, I do, Diego snapped, his voice rising. I know all about you, Ramon, about what you left behind. Ramon felt the floor shift beneath him, his composure flickering for the first time, his gaze locked onto Diego's. You don't know what you're talking about. A cruel smile crept back onto Diego's face. I know you were a soldier. I know what you did back then, what you really are. The words hung in the air, a weight neither of them could ignore. For a moment, the warehouse fell silent. Ramon's breathing grew heavier, memories pressing against the edges of his mind. He saw Diego standing there, not as an enemy, but as a mirror to a past he'd tried to bury. Shut your mouth, kid, Ramon muttered, his voice low and raw. Diego took another step forward, pushing. You can't run from it. You think you can pretend to be someone else now? That's a lie. Ramon's fist tightened at his sides, but he didn't move. The young men behind Diego watched in wary silence. The fight drained from them as they witnessed the invisible battle between the two. Finally, Ramon spoke, his voice firm and steady. Go home, all of you. Diego hesitated, but Ramon's tone left no room for challenge. One by one, the boys began retreating toward the warehouse exit, their steps heavy with defeat and confusion. Diego lingered for a moment longer, locking eyes with Ramon one last time. This isn't over, he said, before turning and vanishing into the darkness. The warehouse fell silent once more. Ramon stood alone, his chest rising and falling as he processed what had just transpired. Diego's words lingered like an echo, reopening wounds Ramon had spent years trying to close. He turned toward the faint light spilling through the broken windows and whispered to himself, It's never over. The evening air carried a weight of unspoken truths as Clara walked into the dimly lit garage where Ramon sat hunched over an old wooden bench. His calloused hands gripped a worn cloth, absently rubbing the edge of a rusted tool, but his mind seemed far away. Clara stood silently for a moment, the faint hum of the city streets filling the space between them. Then, with a deep breath, she broke the silence. You can't keep avoiding me, Ramon, Clara said firmly, her voice cutting through the haze like a blade. I need answers, about everything. Ramon's shoulders tensed, the fabric slipping from his grip. He didn't look up. You don't understand, Nina. Some things are better left buried. Clara stepped closer, refusing to let his avoidance sway her resolve. Buried? Look around you, she said, gesturing toward the cluttered, lonely space he called home. It's already buried you. Whatever you're running from is keeping you here, trapped. Finally, Ramon turned his head slightly, the dim light casting deep lines across his weary face. You think you want the truth, but you don't, he muttered. I do, Clara insisted, her voice softening. Please, tell me. Ramon stared at her for what felt like an eternity before letting out a ragged breath. He rose slowly, his presence seeming heavier than before. He leaned against the bench, hands braced, his eyes shadowed. "They used to call me a lobo." The words fell like stones. Clara blinked. The name echoed faintly in her memory. Whispers from news reports. Old tales of a man who ruled the streets with ruthless efficiency. "The wolf," she murmured. Ramon nodded grimly. "Years ago, I was someone else. Someone dangerous. I did things, terrible things, to survive and to protect those I cared about. I told myself it was the only way." He paused, his voice thick with guilt. "But I became the monster I thought I was fighting." The admission hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Clara could see it now, the scars on his hands, the restless way he moved, the sorrow etched into his expression. She swallowed, steadying her voice. "You regret it. Every damn day." Ramon's voice cracked, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I can't undo the blood on my hands. I can't erase the people I hurt." Clara took a step forward, her eyes unwavering. "Then don't try to erase it, Ramon. Face it. Tell your story. Use it to stop others from going down that path." He looked up sharply, surprised. "And who would listen to a man like me? A criminal?" "People who need to hear it," Clara said earnestly. "The ones who think there's no other way. You can't change what happened, but you can help someone else make a different choice." Ramon turned away, his breath unsteady, as if the weight of her words pressed against his chest. He stared at the bench for a long moment before speaking. "You think it's that simple?" "No," Clara replied gently, "but it's a start." The garage fell quiet again, save for the distant rumble of life outside. Ramon sat down slowly, his expression torn between shame and reluctant hope. Clara sat beside him, not saying another word. For the first time in years, the silence between them didn't feel empty. The quiet hum of the wind carried dust across the empty lot, where Ramon stood, his weathered hands trembling slightly. The sun hung low in the late afternoon sky, painting everything in hues of gold and amber. Around him, the abandoned space seemed to hold its breath as though waiting for what would come next. Across from him, Diego arrived first. He walked with the steady, cautious steps of someone who had carried too much weight for far too long. Behind him, the others followed, a loose circle forming around Ramon, each face carved with suspicion and anger. Ramon counted 3 boys, not much older than Diego, their stances rigid, fists stuffed into worn pockets. Ramon raised his hands slowly, palms open, as if to show he carried nothing but his own fragile resolve. "I came alone," he said, his deep voice rasping in the dry air. "No weapons, no tricks." Diego crossed his arms, his sharp gaze cutting through the space between them. "Why should we believe you? You think we'll forgive everything because you stand here with empty hands?" Ramon met Diego's eyes, steady and unflinching. "No, I don't expect forgiveness," he admitted. "I don't deserve it." A murmur passed among the boys, uncertain and distrustful, but Ramon ignored it. He stepped forward carefully, as though every movement carried the weight of the years he had stolen from Diego's family. "I need you to hear me," Ramon began, his voice quieter now. "Years ago, I made choices that led us here. Choices that left your father dead." He paused, the words slicing through the stillness. "It wasn't just the system or the gangs, it was me. I was part of that chaos." Diego flinched, his jaw tightening. The others exchanged tense glances, but no one spoke. "I spent years convincing myself I had no choice," Ramon continued, his voice thick with something like shame. "That it was just how life works. But the truth is, I had a choice back then, just like you have one now." Diego's brow furrowed. "And what do you think you're doing here, old man? Preaching to us about choices like we don't know how this works?" Ramon nodded, his expression grave. "I came here to tell you that revenge won't fill the hole in your chest. It won't bring him back. I've seen where that path leads. Anger, blood, more loss. I'm still living in that grave I dug for myself." The wind picked up, dust swirling at their feet as Ramon spread his arms slightly. "If you need someone to blame, blame me. If blood is what it takes for you to put this to rest, take mine. I won't stop you." His voice cracked with the weight of his words. "But I'm begging you, don't let this life take you down with it." The boys were silent, their anger momentarily swallowed by Ramon's vulnerability. Diego stared hard at the man, the tension in his shoulders wavering. Ramon stood still, exposed, waiting. Finally, Diego broke the silence. "You're a fool if you think words can fix this." "Maybe," Ramon agreed softly. "But if it stops you from making the same mistakes I did, then it's worth it." The last light of the day flickered, shadows growing around them. No one moved, the moment suspended like a fragile thread waiting to snap. Diego stood frozen, his knuckles white as he gripped the cold steel of the gun. The alley was silent except for the shallow breaths of the others around him, watching, waiting. Ramon's voice lingered in the air, steady but firm. "Vengeance won't bring you peace, boy, it never does." The words echoed in Diego's mind like a distant memory he couldn't shake. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths as he looked down at the weapon in his hands, a choice he now questioned. The anger that had fueled him felt distant, hollow. He saw the fear in the other young men's eyes and the uncertainty etched across Clara's face as she stood to the side, holding her breath. Slowly, Diego's arm began to drop. The gun's weight seemed unbearable, as though every decision he'd ever made was pulling him toward the ground. With a shaky exhale, he loosened his grip, letting the weapon fall to the dirt with a dull, final thud. The others exchanged glances, uncertain of what to do. Ramon stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "This is the first step, the hardest one, but it's yours to take." Something shifted in the group. A shared realization that spread through the air like the first light of dawn. Inspired by Diego's surrender and Ramon's words, the other young men lowered their heads, as though shedding a weight they hadn't known they carried. Clara exhaled, her shoulders relaxing as hope flickered in her eyes. For the first time in weeks, the tension that had hung over them began to dissolve. She looked at Diego, who now stood with empty hands but a heart that, perhaps for the first time, felt full. Sometimes the weight of the past feels impossible to overcome, but true change begins with a single decision, a choice to build something better, no matter how broken the pieces may seem. Ramon's story reminds us that redemption is not about erasing what came before, but about shaping what comes next. And Diego? He teaches us that sometimes walking away is the bravest way to start anew. What would you have done? Would you stay and rebuild, or leave to chase a new beginning? Click the video on the screen to continue your journey of self-discovery and see more stories that challenge how we see ourselves in the world. Don't forget to hit subscribe and join us as we explore more tales of transformation, growth, and redemption. See you in the next chapter.